Under a pale, indifferent morning sky, Marcus Steele, 73 years old and gaunt in his worn army greens, lay crumpled against the cracked curb of Elm Street. Traffic hissed past in a rhythmic rush, the occasional horn bleating like an accusation. Every breath scraped his throat, every heartbeat felt as fragile as spun glass. Around him the world moved in its hurried ritual of commuters and early risers who glanced, frowned, then simply kept walking. A pair of paramedics appeared, one carrying a battered orange kit, the other scanning his face with practiced indifference. "Just another vagrant vet," one muttered, stepping carefully over Marcus's outstretched legs without stooping to help. Marcus fought to focus. The sidewalk tilted. His hands, trembling with exhaustion, closed reflexively around the cold metal chain at his neck. The dog tag, worn smooth at the edges, glinted faintly in the morning light as if it had its own stubborn will to live. Numbers once clear had blurred into a silvery smear, and the emergency contact number was long disconnected. He felt the world contract into a pinpoint of awareness, the distant siren wail, the subtle thud of boots brushing past him, the faint scent of city rain on pavement. Memories tugged at him like gentle hands, helicopter rotors chopping hot Kandahar air, the weight of his kit, Irene's warm hands smoothing his uniform. He coughed and tasted copper. The paramedics moved on, radios crackling with more urgent calls. Drunk, one dismissed him with a shrug. Someone will call it in. And someone had. But under that pale morning sky, Marcus could only wait, hands trembling around his tag as though it might call him home. In his youth, Marcus Steele never thought he'd end up like this. Decades earlier, he had been a steady-handed medic aboard Black Hawk choppers, leaning into the slipstream as they broke low over pockmarked hills and strewn villages in Kandahar. Back then, his hands had been sure and warm, staunching bleeding and splinting fractures, whispering encouragement into the frightened ears of comrades who bled as though their lives were an hourglass that could still be tipped back upright. He could still remember the metallic taste of adrenaline mixed with dust, the way his breath synchronized with the chop of the rotors as they fought gravity together. Even as the aircraft shuddered with turbulence and incoming small arms fire, Marcus was composed, his green eyes steady as he guided trembling fingers to do what was needed. That was what he was trained for, to bring solace, skill, and a sense of control into chaos. When he finally rotated home after years of service, Irene was there on the tarmac, hands clasped together and cheeks tear-streaked with relief. They built a modest life in the suburbs, a tiny white house with one cracked sidewalk slab, geraniums planted stubbornly against peeling siding. It was never much, but it was enough for morning coffee in their kitchen's warm light, enough for the quiet ritual of Sunday laundry and weekend walks to the florist to buy lilies for the dinner table. Though Marcus rarely spoke of what he had seen, the past was a persistent shadow. Even as Irene folded his freshly ironed uniform shirts with careful hands, even as they sat together before the flicker of an old television set, there were nights when his eyes went distant. Occasionally he would tense at a slamming door or shudder when sirens echoed up the street, involuntary responses to traumas that never fully faded. Yet Irene never wavered. Every morning, she pressed his palm gently before seeing him off. Every evening, she greeted him with a patient smile as if she could smooth the ghosts away with her presence alone. They rarely argued, there was a silent pact between them, one stitched together by years of mutual knowing, an understanding that some wounds never healed but could be made bearable. Then, one windy autumn evening, as maple leaves danced in spirals across the porch, Irene faltered. Her breath caught, she leaned against him, trembling. Marcus felt his world slow as she crumpled into his arms. The hours that followed in the sterile hospital light were some of the longest of his life. Her face was pale, hands cold, but she managed a whispered joke as she slipped into a morphine-softened sleep. When the doctors finally spoke in hushed tones and clipped words, "Complications, nothing more we can do, I'm so sorry," Marcus felt the weight of every mile and every rescue collapse inward. Gone was the woman who kept him tethered. Gone was the constant star in his darkened sky. And so began a quieter kind of fight. He honored her the only way he knew how, by returning, every week without fail, to her grave with a small bouquet of white lilies. He would walk the 3 blocks, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the chill as if to ward off the cold that seeped deeper than bone. Along the way, he nodded politely at familiar neighbors and paused at the florist shop door as the bell chimed overhead. In that life, with its measured routines and modest hopes, Marcus found a fragile rhythm again. As long as he could lay lilies on her grave, as long as he could feel the faint touch of her fingers in his dreams, as long as he could hold on to their quiet devotion. And then time did what time does, it eroded names, faces, connections. Streets changed. People moved away. Marcus remained, an aging veteran with only memories for company. The medals and citations tucked away in a worn cigar box in his closet gathered dust. Friends from his service days either passed on or disappeared into their own distant worlds. Each morning as he rose to face another day, he felt more transparent, as if the world were looking through him rather than at him. A passerby might see him trudging to the corner store for bread and coffee, never guessing that this stooped figure had once knelt in helicopter cabins and whispered life into broken bodies. And so the years slipped by, until that fateful morning when his legs failed him on Elm Street and indifference became the last face he saw. Yet in the folds of those memories, of sand and snow, of Irene's hands and whispered prayers, was a fierce and enduring dignity. And as the world hurried past him on that cracked sidewalk, Marcus Steele held on to one thing the world could not take, a soldier's resolve to endure, to remember, and to wait for someone to truly see him once more. That morning on Elm Street, Marcus had set out like so many mornings before, a slow shuffle down his familiar sidewalk, hands tucked into his threadbare jacket as the early chill pressed against his bones. Age had pulled him inward over the years, each new ache a quiet reminder of time's slow theft. Even so, he kept going, moving one deliberate foot before the other toward the flower shop, knowing that this was his ritual of devotion. He never thought much of his surroundings anymore. Familiarity dulled them, the cracked concrete, the leaning lamp post by the corner, the face of the young shopkeeper who nodded but rarely spoke. It was a landscape of habit and quiet endurance. That particular morning, the world seemed a touch more distant. His knees were stiff as unyielding metal hinges, a faint ringing troubled one ear. When his heel caught an uneven seam in the sidewalk, his balance pitched sharply, hands reaching for nothing as gravity pulled him down. He felt the impact before he heard it. A sharp, searing burst of pain shot up his hip, radiating through his ribs as the sky swung into view overhead. Breath scraped his throat. Footsteps paused and then veered. A murmur of concern passed through a passing pair. Someone dialed a phone. When the paramedics finally appeared, Marcus could do little more than blink up at them, his mouth dry and hands trembling. They wore regulation blue and moved with an efficiency that bordered on indifference, trading a few quick glances as they sized him up. Just a drunk, one concluded too easily, gaze sweeping over Marcus's frayed jacket and faded pants. Or diabetic, the other offered with a shrug. He tried to speak, to protest, to remind them he was a veteran, that he had kept other men alive with hands just like theirs, but the words never found purchase. They slid into their practiced rhythm instead, a brief check, a flat stare, the hollow scrape of a gurney not even unfurled. That morning was like so many that had come before, people passed by. A young mother holding her child's hand quickened her pace. An office worker checked his phone rather than look up. Even the paramedics were thinking ahead to their next call, their radios already crackling with new demands. And Marcus was left there as though the street itself had claimed him. The curb dug into his side as he tried to ease his weight. His fingers brushed the dog tag at his chest, an unconscious gesture as though hoping the worn metal could anchor him to someone who might care. That was when a shadow fell across his face and someone paused at last. Louise Chen had left her coffee shop counter to sweep stray napkins that had blown across the sidewalk. She froze as her eyes fell on him, on the slack posture, the faint blue tinge at his lips, the trembling hands clasping that worn tag. Some people might have kept moving. Some might have looked away. But Louise didn't. She knelt without hesitation, her knees pressing into the cold concrete as she studied him properly. This was no drunken vagrant, this was an old man left to wait as though he didn't matter. And as she glanced at the tiny cylinder tucked into his collar, an emergency tube containing folded contact information, she felt a surge of anger that those who had first responded had been so blind or careless. Her hands moved quickly, lifting the tube, checking the name and number inside. Her phone was out before she had even fully read it. There was someone to call. There was someone who would listen. And as she raised the phone to her ear and heard the first ring, Louise thought of all the invisible ones like Marcus Steele, veterans, widowers, wanderers, who disappeared into the background of other people's mornings. She would not let him vanish. Mayor Fairchild, she began urgently when a voice answered. I need you. Right now. And even as the distant wail of an approaching siren carried on the breeze, she stayed by Marcus's side, because for once, someone had finally chosen to see him. Louise knelt there on the cracked sidewalk, the chilled concrete numbing her knees, her palm resting lightly against Marcus's shoulder as though her touch could ward off the isolation wrapped around him. His breaths were shallow but steady, his eyes fluttered beneath pale lids. Her phone was still in her other hand, the call to Mayor Nadine Fairchild left open on speaker. Where exactly are you? Came the voice, measured but laced with concern. Elm and Fourth, Louise replied quickly. He's a veteran. He's hurt. Paramedics came and went like they didn't even see him. A moment of silence followed as the mayor absorbed the information. Louise could hear it in the change of breath, a subtle shift into resolve. Stay with him, the mayor said. I'm on my way. Louise did exactly that. Traffic continued to surge past, the sky lightened slowly as the morning deepened. Occasionally someone glanced their way, as if this small tableau disrupted some unspoken order, an old soldier on the pavement, a young woman cradling a stranger's dignity between her hands. And as minutes stretched, more people began to slow. A bicyclist dismounted and hovered nearby, uncertain but not indifferent. An elderly shopkeeper paused at her door, hands twisting in her apron. A few drivers at the light craned their necks. Yet no one quite crossed that invisible threshold of action until the black SUV finally glided to the curb, hazard lights blinking. The driver was fast, already moving to open the rear door as Mayor Nadine Fairchild emerged. Her tailored coat barely kept out the morning chill, a scarf was tucked into her collar. But it was her bearing that commanded attention, unhurried yet purposeful, an unspoken authority carried in her posture and her eyes. She knelt without hesitation, her hands meeting Louise's. Thank you, she said simply. Her gaze shifted to Marcus. Up close, the details sharpened, the white stubble on his chin, the faint creases at the corner of his mouth as if they once held a smile, the trembling grip on his dog tag. The mayor's face softened. Marcus, she spoke his name aloud, gentle and clear. You're safe now. Help is here. He didn't answer, his eyes stayed unfocused, breaths shallow, but one corner of his mouth twitched, as if some part of him had heard. By then, the driver was back with a blanket from the SUV, unfolding it carefully over Marcus's legs. Another figure, an off-duty firefighter who had seen the commotion, hurried across the street, his hands already checking Marcus's vitals with practiced skill. The mayor rose briefly to speak into her phone. "Dispatch, this is Mayor Fairchild. I need an ambulance priority 1 to my location. Veteran down. Treat with utmost care." A voice on the other end replied immediately. Around them, a circle of quiet witnesses began to grow. The shopkeeper who had paused earlier crossed the street with a cup of warm tea. The bicyclist set his bike against a signpost and stayed, hands tucked into his pockets, face solemn. Even the pedestrians who had brushed past earlier slowed and turned back. And when the sirens began to wail faintly in the distance, Louise felt a quiet relief unfurl. She hadn't known Marcus Steele, not before this morning. She had never heard his name, never shaken his hand or listened to his stories. And yet as she held that fragile thread of his attention and watched the mayor kneel at his side, she understood that his life mattered. Here, on this unremarkable corner of Elm Street, an old soldier who had disappeared into the margins was, for the first time in too long, seen. And that seeing mattered. In the gathering light of morning, with the sirens drawing closer and small pockets of humanity stepping forward, Louise felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones, not as spectacle, not as pity, but as an undeniable call. And across Marcus Steele's chest, beneath the folds of the blanket, his dog tag glinted once more, as if answering. By the time the ambulance eased up to the curb, sirens cycling down into silence, the morning air had lost its earlier chill. 2 paramedics emerged with practiced efficiency, their eyes moving quickly to Marcus and then to the mayor kneeling beside him. "You have him," Nadine Fairchild said calmly but firmly, stepping aside just enough to give them room. "Veteran. Unresponsive at the scene. Treat him like the hero he is." There was a shift in their bearing at those words. The dismissive attitude that had left him ignored earlier was nowhere to be found now. This was a direct order, and more than that, a reminder that someone had witnessed what Marcus was owed. They moved smoothly into their work, vitals taken properly this time, hands sure and focused, stretcher lowered carefully as if lifting fragile glass. Louise stayed close until one of the paramedics gave her a grateful nod. And as they loaded Marcus into the ambulance, his hands still curled around that worn dog tag, she felt something ease inside her chest. "You did good," the mayor told her quietly, voice lowered against the hum of engines and radios. Louise simply nodded. Words felt inadequate for the strange mix of sadness and relief stirring in her. Before the ambulance doors shut, the mayor leaned in one last time. "Hang on," she told Marcus again, so gentle it was almost a prayer. Then they were moving. The flashing lights disappeared down Elm Street as the black SUV idled at the curb. The mayor exhaled, her hands tucked into her coat pockets against the morning air. That was when a few onlookers began to inch closer. First the shopkeeper who had brought tea to the scene. Then the off-duty firefighter who had appeared like a ghost of assurance. Even the bicyclist still hovered nearby, eyes fixed on the spot where Marcus had lain. "You know him?" one asked, voice uncertain. "Not personally," the mayor replied. "But he deserved better." That seemed to strike a chord. One by one, they nodded, strangers brought together by a small, powerful act of recognition. Louise felt the significance settle over them all as they dispersed back into the rhythm of their mornings. A few hours later, at Memorial Medical Center across town, Marcus was being settled into a bed as a dedicated care team reviewed his chart and took the veteran's history the mayor had quickly assembled. Irene's name was there. His years of service. The fading emergency contact number that had failed him before, updated at last to someone who would answer. And in the days that followed, word began to spread. News outlets picked up the story first as a minor human interest piece, a veteran ignored and then rescued, thanks to one determined witness and one public official who had paused to help. But as more people spoke up, other veterans who had been overlooked, caregivers who felt invisible in their work, it began to grow into something larger. City council meetings that might have gone on as usual were instead interrupted by citizens pressing for change. They wanted policies that acknowledged the unique vulnerabilities of aging veterans, protocols to make sure that emergency responders listened as carefully as they acted. At City Hall, memos circulated, new guidelines were drafted. The mayor herself, who had once been a quiet advocate for social causes but rarely the face of them, was now meeting with EMT training supervisors and veteran support groups with a new sense of purpose. And back on Elm Street, a handwritten sign appeared at the curb where Marcus had fallen. To those who serve, it read, tacked to the pole of the leaning streetlight. Beneath it someone had left a single white lily. Each morning, as the shopkeepers raised their grates and pedestrians hurried to their routines, they glanced at the sign and thought of Marcus, the veteran who had been left to wait too long, and the hands that had finally reached down to lift him up. And something in the city shifted, if only slightly, a new awareness that lives we overlook are still part of the fabric that holds us all together. And in that gentle, collective shift, Marcus Steele was no longer invisible. By the time Marcus Steele was moved into a quieter wing of Memorial Medical Center, the story of his rescue had already begun to ripple through the city. Nurses spoke his name as they checked his vitals, their hands gentler than protocol required, their eyes carrying the quiet sympathy of those who had heard what happened on Elm Street. When Marcus finally surfaced into wakefulness, the light in his room was pale and diffused, like morning mist. Outside the window, someone had arranged a small vase of white lilies on the sill, a fragile tribute to a ritual they could not have known was his own. In his hands, cleaned and carefully secured by hospital staff, was his dog Tag. Its worn surface glinted faintly as he brushed his thumb across the etched numbers. Visitors came and went in slow waves. Louise Chen appeared first, balancing a thermos of warm soup and a shy smile. "Just wanted to see you," she said, her voice gentle as though the world might shatter if she spoke too loud. "Better," Marcus whispered back, the word tasting unfamiliar on his tongue. And he was better, not just in his body, though that was slowly mending, but in some deeper, unnameable way. Beyond the hospital walls, City Hall had begun to stir into action. Mayor Nadine Fairchild's decisive response on Elm Street had triggered more than a day of headlines. Emergency protocols were reviewed and rewritten. Dispatchers were trained to double-check for veteran status. First responders practiced new guidelines, where checking an emergency contact tag wasn't optional but mandatory. At Station 9, the house where the inattentive paramedics had come from, the chief ordered a top-down review. Suspensions were handed down, retraining was scheduled. On the break room wall someone tacked up a worn black and white photograph of Marcus Steele in uniform, not as a token of guilt, but as a reminder that every call deserved respect. And on Elm Street itself, the cracked stretch of sidewalk where Marcus had fallen was scrubbed clean. A modest plaque was mounted there reading simply, "He almost died here." We rose. Public forums followed, crowded with citizens. Veterans told their stories, long-ignored accounts of being overlooked and dismissed. Shopkeepers and clerks shared their own small fears about fading into invisibility as they aged. The mayor listened with her chin lowered thoughtfully, hands folded, as though she were carefully collecting each word for safekeeping. And Marcus heard all of this in fragments. A newspaper clipping someone left on his bedside table. A radio report drifting in from the nurse's station. A visiting hospital chaplain mentioning that a new program was being discussed at City Hall, one that would make sure local hospitals had updated emergency contacts for every veteran under their care. "You've changed things," Mayor Fairchild told him during one of her visits, her voice warm and assured. "I didn't do much," Marcus replied, his hands trembling slightly against the sheet. "You survived," she answered. And that was enough. As the days passed and the story wound its way across town, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years. For too long, it had been only him and Irene's memory. Now, there were others, people he might never meet who would look more closely at the strangers they passed, who would check again, who would kneel when someone had fallen. And when hospital staff finally prepared to discharge him into a short-term rehabilitation center, they paused as a small crowd gathered in the hall. A nurse brushed a tear from her cheek. The chief of Station 9 stood quietly at the back, hands folded. Even Louise was there, bright-eyed and steady. Marcus took his first careful step supported by a walker, feeling the strength return to his legs. It was as if, after so long feeling like a ghost, he had become fully solid once more. And stepping into the afternoon light outside the hospital, hearing the rustle of white lilies and a faint cheer from those who had come to see him off, Marcus knew, in his bones, in his breath, that he was seen, and that, finally, he was home. Still standing.